For over 3,000 years, the Vikings and their ancestors kept a secret so carefully buried that mainstream historians never even knew it existed. A secret hidden not in Scandinavia, not in the icy fjords of the north, but thousands of kilometers away, beneath the dry hills of southwestern Spain. And just months ago, in 2026, that secret was finally pulled out of the ground. What archaeologists uncovered there is forcing the academic world to admit something they have resisted for over a century. The story you were taught about the Vikings, about where their power came from, about how their ancestors built one of the most weapon-rich civilizations in ancient Europe, is incomplete. And the truth that has now emerged from Spanish soil is something most museums will never put on a display card. Here's the question that started all of it, a question historians have quietly avoided for over 100 years. How did the warrior ancestors of the Vikings build a civilization armed with thousands of magnificent bronze weapons when their entire homeland had zero copper and zero tin? Where was all that metal really coming from? For decades, the official answer was wrong. In 2026, the real answer was finally unearthed. And what it reveals about a hidden ancient empire that operated across an ocean is something you were never supposed to find out. To understand why this discovery is so explosive, you have to understand what the people of ancient Scandinavia actually built. Long before the Viking raids of the medieval period, thousands of years earlier, the same lands of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway were home to a civilization that archaeologists call the Nordic Bronze Age. These were the direct ancestors of the Vikings, the bloodline, the culture, the lineage, and what they created between 1700 and 500 BCE was extraordinary. They forged swords with edges so sharp and so finely balanced that modern weapon experts still study them today. They cast ceremonial shields covered in spiral patterns, made from bronze sheets only millimeters thick, using techniques that historians once believed were impossible for that era. They created horned helmets, ritual objects of such precision and beauty that when one pair was pulled out of a Danish bog in the early 20th century, researchers initially refused to believe they were 3,000 years old. And then there is the Trundholm Sun Chariot, a sacred bronze and gold artifact crafted around 1400 BCE, showing a horse pulling the sun across the heavens, still considered one of the most stunning prehistoric objects ever discovered. Now here is the chilling part. Every single piece of bronze in every single one of those artifacts came from somewhere else. There's no copper in Scandinavian soil that was workable in the Bronze Age. There's no tin. There never was. These people built an entire bronze civilization on imported metal, and for over 100 years, no one could figure out where it came from. The mainstream theory, the one taught in classrooms for decades, was that the metal came from the Alps. It was geographically logical. Austria and Central Europe had ancient copper mines. The story made sense. It was clean. It was convenient. And it was mostly wrong. The cracks in the official theory began to appear in the last decade, when researchers started applying a forensic-level scientific technique called lead isotope analysis to Bronze Age artifacts. Here's why this matters. Every copper ore deposit on Earth has a unique chemical fingerprint, a specific ratio of lead isotopes locked into the rock itself, formed hundreds of millions of years ago when the mineral first crystallized. When ancient miners extracted that copper, when ancient smiths melted it down and hammered it into weapons, that fingerprint traveled with the metal. It is still there today, locked inside every artifact, 3,000 years later. You might wonder how reliable this science actually is. The answer is unsettling. It is precise enough to trace a piece of bronze back to a specific mountain range, on a specific continent, down to a specific ore body the size of a city block. It is the closest thing archaeology has to a DNA test for ancient metal. And when scientists ran these tests on hundreds of Bronze Age artifacts from museums across Denmark and Sweden, the results made the academic world go silent. The fingerprints did not match the Alps. After roughly 1300 BCE, the copper signatures pointed somewhere else entirely. They pointed southwest, to Spain. But this is where the mystery became almost unbearable. The chemistry was indisputable, the data was peer-reviewed, the signatures were clear, and yet there was no physical proof on the ground. No one had ever found the actual Spanish mines. If 3,000 years ago, ancient miners in Iberia were extracting copper that ended up in a sword buried in Denmark, where were those mines? Why had no archaeologist ever seen them? For more than a decade, this was archaeology's most frustrating mystery. The science said Spain. The ground stayed silent. Until earlier this year. In February of 2026, working through one of the most ambitious archaeological research programs in modern European history, a team led by Professor Johan Ling of the University of Gothenburg, in collaboration with the University of Seville and the Archaeological Museum of Badajoz, made the announcement that stopped the field in its tracks. In a remote inland region of southwestern Spain called Extremadura, near a town called Cabeza del Buey, a region that mainstream archaeology had largely ignored for over a century, they had found them. 6 previously unrecorded Bronze Age mining sites, sitting in plain sight across the Spanish countryside. These were not small holes in the ground. One of the mining complexes alone stretched approximately 200 meters long and 50 meters wide, making it one of the largest Bronze Age mining areas ever documented in Iberia. And scattered across one of the sites, researchers found approximately 80 grooved stone hammer axes, the actual tools used by Bronze Age miners 3,000 years ago to crack open the rock and pull the copper ore out of the earth, still sitting exactly where they were left, as if the miners had simply walked away one afternoon and never come back. Professor Ling described what this discovery actually means, and his words should genuinely make you stop and think. He said, and these are his exact words, "The discovery of the new Bronze Age mines in Extremadura represents only the tip of the iceberg. In this region, as well as in Andalusia, we estimate that as many as 150 prehistoric mines may still remain undocumented and uninvestigated. This has the potential to fundamentally reshape our understanding of the Bronze Age world system. 150 mines, potentially still hidden in the Spanish landscape, each one potentially holding evidence of a global supply chain that operated 3,000 years ago and that mainstream history never told you existed. And here's the detail that makes this story feel almost surreal. Professor Ling's research team has now documented around 20 of these previously unknown Bronze Age mines just between 2024 and 2026. That is not a finished discovery. That is a discovery actively unfolding right now as you watch this video. So how did copper mined in Spain end up in a sword in Sweden 3,000 years ago? This is where the real secret of the ancient world reveals itself. Because to move that much metal across that much distance, you need something that mainstream education almost never describes correctly. You need a maritime trading empire. 3,000 years ago, long before the Roman Empire, long before written records as we know them, there existed a vast and organized ocean trading network. It stretched from the sun-bleached hills of southwestern Spain, along the Atlantic coast of Europe, past Portugal, up through Brittany, into the British Isles, across the North Sea, and into the fjords of Scandinavia. This was not a few wandering merchants. This was a coordinated long-distance supply chain. Professor Ling's Maritime Encounters research program, backed by approximately 46.7 million Swedish kroner in funding, has spent years reconstructing it, and the evidence is staggering. A landmark study published in April of 2025 in the journal PLOS One used computer simulations of ancient Scandinavian plank boats to demonstrate that regular open-sea crossings of stretches like the Skagerrak, some involving 50 kilometers with no visible land in any direction, were happening as early as 2300 BCE. These were not accidental drifts. These were planned voyages, repeated, organized commercial. And the goods that flowed along this network shaped the entire ancient world. Scandinavia gave the South one of its most precious commodities, Baltic amber. The golden fossilized resin found along Scandinavian coastlines was treasured by Mediterranean civilizations. It was traded into Mycenae, into Egypt, into the Levant. Tutankhamun was buried with Baltic amber. In exchange, the metal flowed north, Spanish copper, sailed across an ocean, cast into weapons, hammered into shields, and buried finally in Scandinavian soil, where archaeologists would find it thousands of years later. The bronze sitting in museum cases today was not made in Scandinavia. The raw metal was born in the hills of Spain. And then in May of 2025, another piece of the hidden puzzle clicked into place. A study published in the journal Antiquity, led by researchers from Durham University, revealed that the second ingredient required to make bronze, the tin that gets alloyed with copper, was not coming from Central Europe either. It was coming from Cornwall and Devon in southwestern Britain. Researcher Benjamin Roberts described what they had uncovered. He stated that tin mined by small farming communities in Cornwall and Devon around 3,300 years ago was being traded to kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean over 4,000 kilometers away. He called it the first commodity to be exported across the entire continent in British history. Let that fact settle for a moment. Copper coming from southwestern Spain, tin coming from southwestern Britain, both shipped by sea, combined in northern workshops to forge the swords, helmets, and shields of the people we now call the ancestors of the Vikings. This was a global supply chain 3,000 years ago, and almost none of it appears in the history books most people grew up reading. But the most haunting evidence is something carved in stone. In southwestern Spain, archaeologists have cataloged more than 140 stone monuments called warrior stelae, ancient carved slabs dated between 1400 and 850 BCE, showing armed warriors holding swords, shields, spears, and chariots, and on their heads, distinctive horned helmets. The exact same horned helmet design appears on rock carvings thousands of miles north in Bohuslän in Sweden. The exact same shape as the famous Vixo horned helmets, discovered in a Danish bog, crafted around 900 BCE. How is it possible that warriors in Spain and warriors in Scandinavia, separated by thousands of kilometers of land and sea, were carving and forging the same distinctive ceremonial helmets? Researcher Marta Diaz-Guardamino of Durham University has studied these parallels for years. Her conclusion is clear. She states that bronze objects found across Britain and Scandinavia contain copper, most likely mined in Iberia, and that the warrior imagery shared between these distant regions points to direct contact across the Atlantic, contact that mainstream archaeology resisted accepting for decades. These civilizations were not isolated. They were not separated. They knew each other. They traded with each other. They shared symbols, ideas, and metal across an ocean that was never the barrier we were told it was. It was a highway. And almost everything you have ever been taught about the ancient North being a primitive, isolated world is incomplete. So now, finally, we can answer the question we started with. How did the ancestors of the Vikings build a bronze civilization on land that produced no bronze? They sailed for it. They crossed open ocean in flat-bottom plank boats, through storms, through unknown waters, along an Atlantic trade route stretching thousands of kilometers. They carried Baltic amber south, and they carried Spanish copper and British tin home. And from that imported metal, they forged the weapons and treasures that their descendants, the Vikings, would inherit, and that we now display behind museum glass 3,000 years later. The swords were not made in Scandinavia. The metal was born in Extremadura. The helmets were not isolated inventions. Their design crossed an ocean. The Vikings did not come from nowhere. They came from ancestors who were already globally connected, already trading at a scale most people today still refuse to imagine. The darkest secret of the Vikings was never their weapons, or their raids, or their longships. Their darkest secret was where the very metal of their civilization came from. And for 3,000 years, that secret stayed buried in Spanish soil. Until now, and somewhere in those Spanish hills, researchers believe up to 150 more ancient mines are still waiting to be found. Each one potentially holding evidence of a world that mainstream science is only now, finally, being forced to admit existed. The discovery is not finished. It is happening right now. And what comes out of the ground next may rewrite ancient history again. If this discovery shifted the way you see the ancient world, share it with someone who still thinks history is settled, like this video, so more people get to see the hidden stories that archaeology is finally bringing into the light. And stay subscribed, because the next discovery is already being pulled out of the ground.